Imagine, for a second, that you are standing in a courtroom, you're defending yourself in a criminal trial.
Okay.
But when it's your turn to speak, you don't cite legal precedent.
Right.
You don't bring up past Supreme Court rulings or, constitutional statutes. Instead, you step up to the bench and you start diagramming quantum physics.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you map out network topology. You start calculating the mathematical probability of a single retweet.
I mean, it sounds like the climax of a science fiction novel, right? Like where the protagonist has to outsmart an artificial intelligence or something. But the documents we are analyzing today detail how this actually happened.
Exactly. You bring the literal laws of physics into a courtroom to fight the laws of the state. So today's deep dive explores a fascinating stack of legal documents, appeals, and analytical reports concerning a very specific real-world legal case in China.
Yeah, and it involves a scientist named Dr. Chen Jingwan.
Right. And our mission today is to explore how complex system science and behavioral psychology were, well, weaponized as a legal defense against a digital speech charge.
Which is just a fascinating collision of two completely different worlds.
It really is. Now, really quick, because this stack of sources involves highly charged political art, foreign speeches, and discussions of the CCP and the Chinese legal system, we need to pause here and be incredibly clear with you listening.
Definitely.
The sources we are looking at today contain politically charged content from various viewpoints. And we want to make it absolutely clear that we are not taking any sides or endorsing any of the political viewpoints mentioned.
Right, exactly.
Our goal is strictly to impartially report on the content provided and, convey the fascinating ideas and arguments contained in the original source material.
Yeah, it's a purely analytical look at this profound clash of epistemologies. We're really just examining how a scientist attempts to communicate with a bureaucracy using the language of mathematics.
Right. By the way, your background looks like a cross between a law library and a theoretical physics lab today. Very on theme.
Oh, yeah. Well, I try to set the mood for these things.
I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why a scientist would resort to diagramming network topology to stay out of prison, we first need to look at the seemingly impossible legal puzzle he was trying to solve.
Yeah, the context is key here.
So, Dr. Chen was arrested in September 2022. And he was eventually sentenced to 20 months in prison for the charge of picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
Right.
Now, when you hear that phrase, you might picture someone starting a brawl in a restaurant or smashing windows. But the evidence here was entirely digital. He was convicted for retweeting posts on a foreign app via a VPN.
And the nature of those specific retweets forms the crux of all the legal arguments that follow. From the sources we have, the evidence consisted of things like an Umbrella Girl cartoon, which is a piece of political art.
Okay.
There was some political commentary, including a video of a speech by Donald Trump criticizing communism.
Right.
There was also historical data, specifically tracking edits made over time to Mao Zedong's published works. And finally, there was a photograph of a candlelight vigil.
So the evidence is this mix of art, foreign political speech, historical documentation, and, emotional expression.
Exactly.
And here's the legal logic the prosecution used to secure a conviction. The court noted that Dr. Chen has a high level of education. He holds a PhD.
Right.
Therefore, the court presumed he should know right from wrong. Following that thread, the court determined he possessed the subjective knowledge that the posts he was retweeting were false information or rumors.
Yeah, they essentially substituted the requirement to prove actual subjective intent with an assumption based purely on his academic credentials.
I mean, that feels a bit like getting a speeding ticket while your car's parked in the garage just because you own a sports car and, should know how fast it can go.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to put it.
And beyond that, how do you objectively prove that a cartoon or a picture of a candle is a false fact? I mean, a cartoon isn't a factual claim, it's art. It doesn't have a binary truth value.
What's fascinating here is that this highlights a critical distinction the defense raises: the difference between a behavior crime and a result crime within this legal framework.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Well, picking quarrels and provoking trouble in this specific digital context is categorized legally as a result crime.
Right.
That means the law explicitly requires proof that the behavior in question caused a specific measurable outcome. In this case, the required outcome is severe disruption of public order.
Meaning it's not enough to just post the picture of the candle.
No.
The post has to actually cause chaos in the real world.
Yet, according to the analytical reports in our sources, the court provided 0 metrics to prove any disruption occurred.
Wow, 0.
None. There were no records of offline events triggered by the posts. There was no data showing network server crashes. There were no economic loss reports.
So they just assumed it happened.
Well, basically. The court treated the severe disruption as a self-evident truth rather than a factual claim requiring empirical proof.
That is wild. And because the court provided no data to prove a disruption occurred, Dr. Chen decided to use mathematics to prove a disruption was physically impossible.
Exactly.
Which is brilliant because his expertise happens to be in nonlinear complex systems.
Yeah.
He didn't just argue that he didn't cause disruption. He argued that the physics of the network dictated that he couldn't have caused one.
Yeah. He essentially puts the social media platform itself on trial. He analyzes its structural physics.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let me play devil's advocate for a second, though.
Okay, go for it.
We've all seen random people with 10 followers go viral out of nowhere, right?
Sure.
One minute you post a silly video, the next minute it's on the national news. Why couldn't just one single retweet from his account trigger a massive viral reaction? Think about the butterfly effect. Like a butterfly flaps its wings and causes a tornado across the globe. Why couldn't his tweet be the butterfly?
Well, Dr. Chen addressed that exact premise using the mathematics of network topology. You see, the butterfly effect only applies when a system is in a very specific, highly unstable state, what physicists call a supercritical state.
Okay.
To understand why his retweets couldn't trigger an avalanche, we have to look at the structural reality of his account within the broader network. The sources note he had fewer than 100 followers, and his past posts had almost 0 engagement.
But how does his follower count translate into network physics, though?
Right, so in the mathematical modeling of networks, his account is classified as an edge node.
An edge node.
Yeah, and to understand why an edge node can't start a tornado, Dr. Chen's defense relies on Cohen's threshold for scale-free networks.
I'm going to need you to break down scale-free network for me.
Absolutely. So think about the highway system in a country. Most cities have a relatively similar number of highways connecting to them. It's somewhat evenly distributed. That's a random network.
Makes sense.
Now think about the airline system. You have a few massive hubs like Atlanta or Dubai with thousands of flights.
Yeah.
And then you have thousands of tiny regional airports with only 1 or 2 flights. That is a scale-free network. It operates on a power law, an extreme 80-20 rule.
Okay, so here we go.
Social media is a scale-free network. You have massive celebrity hubs and millions of tiny isolated users.
Regional airports, the edge nodes.
Correct. Cohen's threshold is a mathematical principle showing that massive, scale-free networks are incredibly robust against localized disruption.
Oh, because so much of the traffic relies on the big hubs anyway.
Exactly. Because the vast majority of the network's connectivity relies on the massive hubs, the edge nodes simply do not have the structural power to trigger macro-level chaos.
Wow.
You could completely remove or highly activate thousands of these edge nodes, and the overarching structure of the network would remain entirely undisturbed.
So structurally, a regional airport can't cause a global flight ground stop on its own.
Precisely. And he compounds this structural argument by introducing the Galton-Watson extinction theorem and branching processes.
Okay, what's a branching process?
Imagine a branching process, like a spark trying to start a fire in a forest. The average branching ratio, represented mathematically as the letter m, is the average number of new sparks created by one initial spark.
Right, so if I share a post and 2 of my friends share it, that's the branching.
Exactly. If m is greater than 1, meaning each spark creates 2 more sparks, the fire grows exponentially. That is your viral cascade.
But we established his account had barely any followers and historically 0 engagement.
Which means his branching ratio was significantly less than 1. The math formula in the sources represents this as m is much less than 1.
Okay.
In complex systems theory, this indicates the system surrounding him was in a deep subcritical zone.
It's like throwing a single spark into a damp freezing forest.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. The Galton-Watson theorem mathematically dictates that in a deep subcritical zone, the probability of a cascade or an avalanche of information approaches 0.
It's just physically impossible.
Right. It's not just unlikely. The physical laws governing the network dictate that the cascade will inevitably go extinct. He is proving that he mathematically lacks the capacity to cause the result the crime requires.
And what's crazy is the sources also point out there was an actual real-world control experiment that proved his math was correct.
Oh, right. The 2-year period.
Yes. After Dr. Chen finished his 20-month sentence, he checked the internet. His posts were still up.
Unbelievable.
They hadn't been deleted by the censors. And they still had 0 retweets and 0 engagement. I mean, if those posts possessed the inherent power to severely disrupt public order, they had 2 years to do it, completely unhindered, and nothing happened.
The measurable disruption was absolute 0.
But, okay, this brings up a massive contradiction. I have to push back on the entire premise of using math here.
Let's hear it.
Isn't applying network physics to a legal charge just a brilliant piece of academic smoke and mirrors to try and get out of jail? Because human beings aren't mathematical nodes. A cartoon of an umbrella or a picture of a vigil isn't just a data point. It has deep emotional and political resonance. Maybe the court just rejected the math because human society is more complicated than an equation.
Well, the source material anticipates that exact skepticism. To answer why the legal system convicted him despite the mathematical proof of 0 disruption, the behavioral psychology analysis in our sources shifts the lens.
How so?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to move from analyzing the physics of the digital network to analyzing the behavioral psychology of the institutional network.
Because institutions are complex systems too.
They are. The analysis argues that this conviction wasn't about an isolated error in legal reasoning or a judge simply misunderstanding a math equation. It was the predictable, inevitable output of an institutional reinforcement matrix.
Okay, break that down for me.
The documents delved heavily into the concept of operant conditioning within the justice system.
Operant conditioning. That's the foundational psychology of reward and punishment, right? You reward the behavior you want to see, and you punish the behavior you want to stop.
Exactly. Look at the specific reinforcement mechanisms at play for the officials handling this case. The sources indicate there is massive positive reinforcement promotions, positive performance reviews, political approval awarded for closing cases quickly and making them ironclad.
While on the flip side, there is severe negative punishment. If an official questions the evidence or pushes back on the procedural validity of a charge,
they face the risk of being sidelined. They lose performance points or face accountability probes.
Wow. So you have an environment heavily rewarding the desired conclusion, a swift conviction, while actively punishing strict adherence to procedural verification if it slows down that conclusion.
Yeah.
It makes me think of a machine learning algorithm that has been optimized for the completely wrong metric.
Oh, that's a really good point.
Like, if you train an AI to clear an email inbox as fast as possible, and you only reward it for an empty inbox, it's just going to delete everything.
Right, it doesn't care about the content.
Exactly. It won't read the emails. It won't check if an email is important. It just deletes. The legal system in this analysis essentially habituated to identifying sensitive tags.
Yeah.
It sees VPN. It sees a foreign platform. It sees a piece of political art. And it automatically triggers a conviction script. It skips the cognitive load of actually verifying if the legal requirements like proving a public disruption were met.
And the psychological analysis in the sources uses the specific term SR habituation for this, stimulus response habituation.
Okay.
The complex, nuanced task of legal analysis is downgraded into an automated reflexive script. And to execute that script without the individuals in the system experiencing psychological distress, the institution engages in what psychologist Albert Bandura called moral disengagement.
Well, yeah, because they're still dealing with a human being's life. Locking someone in a cage should cause a psychological toll on the person turning the key.
Exactly. And the sources detail how the system actively ignores the value of Dr. Chen's positive personality traits to mitigate that toll.
Right.
His academic curiosity, his peaceful nature, his lifelong record as a scholar, all of that is entirely flattened. He is reduced from a complex human being into a mere negative stimulus that the system needs to process and clear.
And because this institution operates as a closed-loop system, there are no real-world feedback mechanisms to correct its own errors.
None.
The math says this edge node didn't cause a disruption. The physical reality of the 2-year control experiment says nothing happened. But the closed-loop system rejects those inputs entirely because they conflict with the automated conviction script.
The institution becomes completely sealed off from empirical reality.
So where does that leave Dr. Chen? You have a defendant wielding complex network physics and an institution locked in a behavioral feedback loop that refuses to look at the math.
It leaves him writing for an entirely different audience.
What do you mean?
Faced with a closed-loop system that fundamentally rejects mathematical reality, Dr. Chen's defense transformed. It evolved from a legal strategy designed to get out of prison into a philosophical time capsule.
So what does this all mean? Like, what did he write?
The documents note that he wrote a profound letter while incarcerated. It's often referred to in the sources as the prison blood letter.
Oh, wow. But the text explicitly states it was not aimed at the judges who convicted him.
Right. It was written for future readers.
Yeah.
He stops trying to win the court case and starts trying to document an epistemological crisis.
Epistemological being the key word there. This becomes a clash over how we define what is true.
Exactly. The legal system in this case operates on a demand for absolute truth and binary certainty. A piece of information is either a fact or it is a rumor.
Yeah.
And the court claims the ultimate authority to label which is which.
But Dr. Chen, functioning as a scientist, invokes Gödel's incompleteness theorem to dismantle that authority.
Which is just a devastating intellectual counterpunch. Kurt Gödel was a mathematician who proved that in any sufficiently complex logical system, there will always be statements that are true but cannot be proven within the system itself.
I always struggle a bit with Gödel. Can you break down how a mathematical theorem applies to the legal definition of a rumor?
Sure. Think about the classic paradox. This statement is false.
Okay.
If it's true, then it's false. If it's false, then it's true. Gödel proved mathematically that contradictions and unprovable truths are baked into the very fabric of logic.
Right.
Therefore, any system, whether it's a mathematical model or a judicial bureaucracy that claims to possess absolute, complete truth, is mathematically flawed.
Oh, I get it. So Dr. Chen is telling the court, your demand for absolute certainty, your insistence on binary labels of truth and rumor regarding art and emotional expression is scientifically impossible.
Yes.
You're trying to force the chaotic, complex reality of human expression into a rigid, linear box that the laws of physics dictate does not actually exist.
This raises an important question, one that lies at the very heart of his letter. How can a society penalize a single citizen for the inherent physical disorder of a complex network?
Yeah.
As we discussed with the network topology, social systems are naturally chaotic. They fluctuate. Dr. Chen argues that true scientific rationality requires humility.
Right.
It requires acknowledging uncertainty, recognizing the limits of human cognition, and accepting that some level of disorder is a physical constant in any complex system.
While the institutional power, in contrast, used what the sources call political labels to cover up a lack of empirical proof.
Exactly.
When they couldn't empirically prove he caused chaos, they just labeled him a chaotic element to maintain their own illusion of total, unshakable order.
It's the ultimate hubris of a bureaucracy clashing with the foundational humility of science. Dr. Chen's time capsule is a warning about what happens when institutional power decides it can override the laws of physics and mathematics simply by issuing a verdict.
And that ties this entirely back to you, listening right now. Because while this deep dive has been focused on one specific, highly complex legal case in China, the implications ripple out to all of us.
Absolutely.
We all leave digital footprints.
Yeah.
We all exist as nodes in these massive, scale-free networks.
We're all interacting within complex systems governed by nonlinear dynamics, constantly generating data that institutions attempt to measure.
Yeah. This isn't just about Dr. Chen's freedom. It is a profound look at what happens when the literal physics of the internet, the math that governs how information flows, cascades, or dies out, collides with the rigid, linear, and often flawed logic of institutional bureaucracies.
It forces us to examine the tension between how reality actually works and how institutions demand that it works to maintain their own operational loops.
Exactly. So I want to leave you with a lingering question to ponder as you go about your day, scrolling through your own networks. As our social spaces become increasingly governed by complex, unpredictable, nonlinear dynamics, what happens when the laws that govern us refuse to evolve past simple linear assumptions? If the legal definition of reality completely detaches from mathematical reality, if the X-ray clearly shows the arm isn't broken, but the system decides to put it in a cast anyway who is actually causing the severe disruption of public order,